Hello everyone, my name is Jeff Miesbauer, Content Manager at Agiloft. Welcome to today's training webinar titled How to Configure Data Import-Export in Agiloft, hosted by Agiloft implementer Geoff Wilson. Today's training will explain how to use data import and export to better streamline your workflows and enhance security in your system. The presentation will be about 21 minutes, followed by a live Q&A with Jeff. Please submit your questions in the appropriate window in the Zoom platform at any time during the presentation. It takes a minute to queue up the video, so please bear with us as we do that.
My name is Geoff Wilson, and I'm an implementer with Agiloft. Today I'll be presenting a webinar designed by Pinky Kriplani, one of my colleagues on the implementation team. The topic today is moving data in and out of your Agiloft system using the data import and export functions. We'll begin by looking at some common scenarios where you might need to import or export data to or from the system. We'll go through the import and export wizards, discussing the available options, then outline some special procedures related to importing attachments. Since it's often important to import records in a particular sequence, we'll describe our best practices surrounding imports. Last, we'll look at the options to automate imports and exports by using import and export actions triggered by time-based rules. There are several reasons why you might need to import a lot of data into your system all at once. Common use cases include uploading the company, location, and contact information for all your customers, vendors, or counterparties, bringing a list of your company employees into Agiloft from an HR system, importing legacy contracts from another system, and uploading attachments related to those contracts. It's important to spend a little time planning your import in order to think through how the data will be used in Agiloft. We'll discuss some of the most common considerations later. There are two options available to bring data into Agiloft. It's possible to bring data into several tables at once using the global import feature. This is found by going to Setup, then Import. Data can be imported from this wizard in several formats: Excel spreadsheets, XML files, text files, TGZ files, and Salesforce data obtained from a Salesforce database. In this kind of import, individual sheets in the import file are mapped to individual tables in the system. The other option to bring data into Agiloft is by importing records directly into a single table. This is probably the most common method. From the Target Table's action bar, hover your mouse over the arrow beside the Actions button, then select Import from the drop-down that appears. In this kind of import, your data file can be an Excel spreadsheet, XML file, or JSON format. You can also use a delimited text file, with options to set the characters that serve to delimit each field. The tabs of the Import wizard are similar for global imports and single table imports. The main difference is that in a global import, you'll be mapping multiple data sources to multiple tables. We'll use the single table import wizard to get to know the options better. On the Data Source tab, you can choose the location where your data is currently stored. This can be a file on your local hard drive or the temp or home folders on your KB's server. Scheduled imports, which we'll discuss later, allow data to be pulled from an external SFTP site. On the File Name tab, you can either select the file located on the server or browse your local hard drive, select the correct file, and upload it. Choices here depend on the data source selection you made on the previous tab. Imports are limited to 2 GB, so if your source data set is extremely large, you may need to split up the import into phases that are each smaller than 2 GB. On the Data Format tab, you can select the format of the file you uploaded on the previous tab. The system is able to identify the file format in most cases and selects the appropriate value automatically, but you may need to make small adjustments to the values here if you're importing from a text file. Some different data format options are available for global imports. On the Options tab, you can choose whether rules and workflow actions will run on the imported data. Depending on the use case, you may wish to not run rules after import. For example, if you're importing legacy contract data into a live system that has rules that send out notifications when new records are created, you may wish to deselect the Run Rules option to avoid sending out unnecessary emails. The Password is In section is relevant only if your imported data includes password fields. If so, you'll select whether the password data you're importing is in plain text or already encrypted. On the Table tab, you can select the table where the data will be imported. The Skip First Row option allows you to import spreadsheets where the first row has column headers rather than actual data. You can also choose whether the system will create missing choice values when importing data into existing choice fields, and how to deal with errors in the import process. On the Records tab, you can control how the imported data interacts with existing records. Selecting Append New Records will only create new records. The second, third, and fourth options all allow you to specify a unique identifier to match records and either replace, skip, or update them. Typically, we use the record ID as the unique identifier, but it is possible to designate a different value if necessary. The final option to delete all records before importing should be treated with caution, as there's no easy way to recover records deleted by this process. On the Fields tab, you can select which columns from your data source are mapped to fields in the target table. The system will attempt to match the column headers to the field names, so it's usually worthwhile to clean up the source data and column headers to match the target field names, and to remove columns that will not be imported to avoid confusion or errors. Let's look at an import in action to bring some data into the company table. From the action bar in the company table, mouse over the Actions button and select Import from the drop-down list. On the Data Source tab, we'll leave Local Hard Drive selected and click through to the File Name tab. Clicking the Choose File button allows us to browse our local drive where we can select the Excel spreadsheet prepared for this demo. Once the file name is visible in the field, click the Upload button to copy the file into Agiloft. When this is finished, the file will appear under the Import box. On the Data Format tab, the system has already selected Excel Spreadsheet as the data type, so we can leave this and move on to the Options tab. Here, we'll choose to execute workflow actions and run rules after our import is finished. We have no password fields to import, so we can move on to the Table tab. Here, the Companies table is selected by default, since our import originated from that table. We'll leave the options to skip the first row and not create missing choice values. We'll choose to raise errors when choice fields or date fields have invalid choices, and to stop the import if some rows fail. Lastly, we'll leave the date format order as it is. Note that this might need to be changed depending on your geographic region. On the Records tab, we'll leave the Append New Records choice selected since these are new company records. When appending new records, all the remaining options are grayed out. On the Fields tab, the system has mapped the column headers to the field names. Since they match, there's no need to change them if we want all this data. Click the Finish button to simply import the new records. When the import is complete, we can see that the system processed 8 records, creating 8 new companies with IDs 51 through 58. If we navigate to the Company table, we can see the new companies. Importing attached files is slightly different from importing data to create records. This is because we must provide files for the system to upload rather than just a single spreadsheet. We will need to associate these attachments with some parent record. Typically, this is a contract, but it could be any kind of parent record that has attachments. We will need to prepare a data file with a column for a unique identifier that specifies the parent record with which the attachments should be associated. It's common to use the parent record ID for this purpose. We'll also need a column that stores the file name, including the file extension, for each file that is to be imported. Here, it's essential that the file name in the data source column matches the actual file name exactly. Any difference in the names will produce an error and the file will not be imported. The files to be attached must be placed in a folder called Files. The data file and the Files folder must be zipped together in a single file in order for the import to work. When importing the files, the unique identifier must be mapped to the corresponding field and selected on the Records tab. The file name column must be mapped to the attached file field. So to import contract attachments, we would actually import these to the Contracts table using the contract ID as the unique identifier. On the Records tab, we would select an Update Import matching on the contract ID and using all duplicates if it's the case that a contract could ever have more than one attachment. On the Fields tab, there's a special field called Transitional Contract Files that's built to handle this situation. Simply map the contract ID to itself and the file name column to the Transitional Contract Files field. Be sure to select the option to run rules from the Options tab. Once the import is completed, a rule in the Contracts table will turn all these attached files into attachment records associated with the contract selected. Special care needs to be taken when importing records to multiple tables that are supposed to be linked to one another. Imagine that you're importing a series of companies and contacts into a new system, along with their contracts and attachment. Our best practices always begin with the background tables. Companies come first, so that when it comes to importing the company corporate, shipping, and billing addresses, there's a company ID that can be used to link the locations back to the companies. The same is true for contacts, who typically need to be associated with the company. After the background tables have values, then the process tables can be populated. For example, legacy contracts can be entered with values for the company ID, location ID, and main contact ID included in the data spreadsheet. This links the contract to its counterparty. Once the contract records exist, then the attachments can be imported. Special care should also be taken when importing data into fields configured to accept multiple values. When importing data into a multi-value enabled field, the values must be comma separated. However, if the data you're trying to push into an MVE field consists of text strings that may contain commas, you may need to choose a different separator. MVE fields cannot be used as unique identifiers. On the Fields tab of the Import Wizard, there's a test button which allows users to perform a test run of the import without actually bringing in any data. This can be useful in finding errors in your data without creating useless records in your system. Exporting data from your Agiloft system is useful to update external systems with Agiloft record values. For backing up your data, for example, before implementing major changes to the system rules that have the potential to overwrite values, or creating templates for imports to particular tables. As with imports, system exports can be done globally from the Setup menu or from individual tables. Global exports allow users to pull data from several tables at once and output them in ASCII, Excel, XML, or Agiloft formats. To export records from a single table, mouse over the Actions button on the action bar, then select Export from the drop-down that appears. For this webinar, we'll use the individual table export wizard. On the Destination tab, you define the location where the data will be exported. Just like the choices for import, you can export data to your local hard drive or to the temp directory or home directory on the server. Use the Data Format tab to define the file format for the exported data. On the Options tab, you can choose to export only records you selected by clicking the checkboxes to the left of the records in the table view, or all the records returned by a saved search, or all records in the table. You can choose to export the data to include the field labels. This last option is useful when making import templates. Your export can include all the fields in the table, making it a true backup, or only selected fields, including or excluding attached files. Let's look at an export in action to extract some data from the company table. From the action bar on the company table view, mouse over the Action button and select Export from the drop-down list. On the Data Source Destination tab, we'll leave the local hard drive selected and click through to the Data Format tab. Here, we'll leave the default Excel format selected and move on to the Options tab. Under the Export heading, we'll leave the All Records default selected, and we'll include the field labels. Under Fields, we could select just the fields we want by checking or unchecking the individual boxes to the left of each field. For this demo, we'll select Export All Fields, making this a true backup. After clicking Finish, the system prepares the export. Depending on the number of fields selected and the number of records in the table, the time required to process the export changes. When the export is finished, click the link to download the generated file. Import actions can be triggered by time-based rules in order to keep information in Agiloft in sync with an external system. For example, your company may use a separate system to manage employee information, tracking things like job title, working status, department, etc. You can set up a nightly import that updates existing employees and creates new employees using an import action. Typically, the external system exports a data file which is stored on an SFTP server. The import action then grabs this file, updates Agiloft, and generates a log file to track the results of the import. This log can be emailed to a specific email address. Creating an import action is similar to running an import manually. The most significant changes come on the Data Source tab. Here you can select a folder on the server, a field in the table on the KB, or an external SFTP server. In order to use an external server, you'll need to provide the login and password so that the system can find the correct file. You must also provide the exact file path, so the external data file needs to be named exactly the same every time it's generated and placed in the same spot on the SFTP server. You'll need to specify the data type and upload a sample data file. The rest of the Wizards tabs work like the manual import discussed earlier. On the Fields tab, the mapping choices that you make for this data file will be used by the system to map data in each import. If your implementation relies on multiple scheduled imports that affect several tables, you may want to schedule a global import. This way, a single report can be generated that summarizes the success or failure of each individual import. This configuration uses 3 tables: an import summaries table to collect the import summaries, an import templates table to hold templates for each of the imports to be scheduled, and an import logs table to hold the log files generated after each import runs. Conversely, you might want to schedule an export from Agiloft in order to import that data into another system or to take a regular backup of your data. This uses an export action. The wizard for the export action is very similar to the manual export wizard we looked at earlier. On the Destination tab, you can specify where the exported file will be stored. You can select a folder on the server where your KB is hosted, or an external URL, most likely an FTP or SFTP site. You'll need to provide a username and password to the site, or a private authentication key and a user. On the Data Format tab, choose the file format to be exported. On the Options tab, select the fields to export, decide whether to export attachments, and provide a file name. Note that unlike manual exports, there is no option to limit the export to the results of a saved search on the Options tab. We'll conclude today's webinar with a quick demo of import and export action setup. Let's configure an import action for the Companies table. Go to Setup, Companies, then Actions, and select Create Import Action from the list of actions. After giving the action a name, we'll enter the URL of our Agiloft FTP site information, then choose a sample file from our local hard drive and click Upload to copy that to the server. Then we'll verify our data file as an Excel spreadsheet, provide an email address to send the log file. On the Options tab, we'll select the option to enable workflow guards. On the Table tab, we'll leave the default selections as they are. On the Records tab, we'll confirm the selection to append new records. On the Fields tab, ensure that all the fields we want to import are mapped correctly. Once we click Finish, the import action is ready to use. You can find it with a T prefix in the list of actions. You'll probably want to configure a time-based rule to trigger this action nightly, weekly, or monthly. Here's an export action for the same table. Click on Setup Companies, then Actions, then select an export action. We'll give the action a name on the General tab, select our FTP on the Destination tab, and confirm our file type on the Data Format tab. On the Options tab, we'll use the Set All Fields button to select all available fields, confirm the settings for field labels, attached files, and file name, and enter an email address for the log file. After clicking Finish, our new action is visible in the list of actions, marked with an X prefix. Thanks for watching today's webinar. We hope that you find the information here useful for your implementation. If you have any questions, please reach out.
Okay, let's open it up for Q&A with Geoff. I'll start with the one that we always get. Will the recording be available after the webinar? Yes, you will receive a copy of this training, a link to the video as well as the slides, and that'll be available in 24 to 48 hours. And so look out for that email. It'll also be on our website at agiloft.com/events. Let's see, we got a couple questions coming in. Can you give a demo for importing attachments? I don't know, Geoff, is there an easy way to explain that, or a resource we can point them to for this?
I can explain it. It's not really something that I'm set up right now to do, but are you talking about attachments, I assume, for the contracts table, like contract attachments? Basically, if you're doing legacy contract data, you'll have to import your contract records first. So you'll get your metadata all together and get that, which will give you a series of contract IDs. And you'll need the contract IDs in one column in a list. Let me see if I've got a file here that I can share just to show you what that would look like with a sort of set of dummy data. And the actual import is really fairly simple in terms of its spreadsheet. It's simply got a column for that unique identifier, which is usually the record ID, and then it's got a column for file name. Let me just see if I can. I don't have a good dummy one here set up, but the file name is just the file name with the file extension of whatever it is. So it's typically PDF or docx. And then you import that to the contracts table so you import the attached file name to the transitional contract files field, and you match on the contract ID. So you're using an update import to do that. That's basically it. When we export attachment, oh, sorry, Geoff, are you going to read that one?
Yeah, let's go to Kevin's first.
Sure.
Are there plans to allow additional import options beyond SFTP, especially important for KBs that are hosted by Agiloft where we don't have access to the server directories?
There are currently options to move things from those servers. I don't actually know if there are. What other kinds of things would you be interested in? I mean, there is an option to import things from a file in the field. Secure HTTP. That's a good question. Not that I know of. but it's always possible that the product development team is working on something. I can take that feedback back to them.
Yeah, and we in Agiloft support, you can request enhancements for that kind of thing, and that's the kind of feedback that our implementers definitely pass along. The more we hear it, the more likely those kind of things are happen. Let's go to Tanya's. When we export attachments, the files come in one folder that have no association with the record it came from. Is there a way to export attachments that identifies the records from which they were attached?
You're talking about doing an export from an Agiloft system? If you are, the answer certainly is yes. It kind of depends on where you're exporting them from. So you can export them either directly from the attachments table, in which case there's a field for the contract ID that you can use, or if you're exporting them from contracts, then you can get the contract ID for those. Do you have is it an Agiloft system that you're exporting things from? So
Yes.
what you'll need to do is export both the attachments and either the attachment ID would be okay, contract ID would probably be better as a separate thing, and then you should be able to get those. What's the use case? You're exporting the attachments and then you want to import them again? I don't know.
Well, we may. Okay.
Contract data is only in the spreadsheet. The attachments come zipped in one folder. You should be able to export them right from the attachments table and include, it might be a bit of a two-step process, but you could include the attached file name, the contract ID, the attachment ID, and then match that against an export from the contract, which would have the contract ID in it as well. That might be the easiest way to do that.
Okay. Gabriel's asking, do REST APIs have the same capabilities for attachments?
To import attachments, I mean, so long as you're importing to the transitional contracts files field in contracts, that's a system automation. So it should not depend on APIs as long as the rules configured to use them should work. There's a rule in your contracts table. It's named a little differently depending how old your KB is, but it's something like handle transitional contract files that tells the system once there is something in a transitional contract file field to convert it to an attachment and map it in to the contract. Those rules can be configured either to run just on web input or on web and API. So as long as your rule is enabled for API, there shouldn't be any problem.
Cool. Great. And going back to Ashish on the importing attachments, we can follow up with you and maybe get a quick demo. Either that, or you can email your question to news@agiloft.com and we can reply. But I'll be happy to follow up and see if we can get a more clearer answer, or there might be a demo that we can find that fits your question. So yeah, thanks for that. I think we have probably time for about one more. Let's see this one here. Can I use export to create backups of my data?
Yeah, you can. The simplest way to do it, if you want something scheduled, is just to create a time-based rule that at some interval, weekly, monthly, yearly, whatever, just runs an export action. It's the last part of the video that I showed here. And the export action would just need to specify which fields you wanted. So if you wanted a true backup, you'd use all fields. Those can get pretty big, particularly if you're backing up contracts table with attachments or something. So what you might want to do is go through the options for the fields to include and not include the kind of system background fields that you probably don't care about.
Yeah, what, Sunny, what is the preferred format other than Excel?
Preferred other than Excel. Lots of people use comma separated text files or comma separated Excel files. Sometimes people will end up needing to use pipe separated or semicolon separated things because the data that they're importing is something a little bit different. Yeah, so I'm just looking around to see if I can find a quick way. I can sort of show a little bit what the attachments import might look like if people want to see a little bit of that. I can share and show something.
Sure. We still have a quick minute if people want to see it. I can.
Oh, I can't. Yeah. Okay.
Are you ready?
Yeah. So you would end up with a file that looks something like this. And you just have your contract IDs over here and the name of your file over here. I can make this a bit bigger if that helps. Along with the file extension. And then what you do is take this Excel file and a separate file folder called files that contains just these files, and you zip them together. And once they're zipped together, then you would go to, sorry, let me do this real quick here. You would go to the contracts table. Under the action bar, hit import from your local drive, choose that file. And then when you're doing the mapping on the records tab, let me see if I can do this really quick for you. Sorry, let me do this. No, I don't have a good demo file. But that's how you would do it. Basically just like that.
Yeah, so if you have any other questions, please type them into the Q&A. And while we're here, I want to thank Geoff again for his time producing this session. Trevor's asking, what about company docs?
Company docs are kind of the same thing as transitional contract files attachments. There isn't a transitional files field built out in companies. So when you did that one, you'd probably want to map the company ID in when you're doing it. So you'd have basically the, if it's a new company doc or a series of legacy ones, you'd map in the company docs with the files and the company ID, and you'd import appending new records so that each of those ones would get a brand new company doc ID. You'd have the company ID that associates it, and it just shows up in the contract as a search result. So any contract for that company would show, for example, certificates of insurance or whatever with that.
Great. And we're out of time for today, but if you have further questions, please email us at news@agiloft.com or get in touch with your implementer. I'm sure they'd be happy to help out. Thanks again. If you enjoyed this session, check out our full webinar series at agiloft.com. Next week, we're going to have a great talk with Colin Levy on demystifying legal tech. I think that'll be a really good talk with Daniel Hoagland as well. So thanks everyone, and we hope to see you next week.